afterlife. This material abundance was the best that a human life could aim for. And to do that, the family had to be moved off center stage, and the children had to be processed like raw materials. These are the people who saw to it with their influence that when legislation that was wildly radical based on any past model was proposed, that the right legislators would vote that legislation through. They saw to it that money was available to build these vast piles of brick and stone and to drain children out of the community by the force of law, mind you. If you gave children and families options, it probably would take half a decade before many people tried the options. But I think inside of a decade, the institutional schools would vanish because they don't teach the way children learn, nor can they teach the way children learn. That's not what they're set up to do. They're set up to produce a predictable, homogeneous, safe product. They're set up to sort people into occupational categories, roughly consonant with what the current economy demands. Your theorists, through history, were the first to reflect on the best, most efficient ways to manage populations. And your theorists worked out state institutions very early on. I'll give you one example that caused the socialization of populations and the stratification of populations to take place, I won't say indelibly, but certainly to an extreme degree, very early on in the 17th and by the middle of the 18th century, the stratifications across Europe were perfect, and there was no way really to escape unless you were a highly unusual person and you could see through a lot of the constraints on us, a lot of the strings that hold us like puppets are really inventions of our own mind. I'm not saying that there aren't armies and police and various ways to punish deviance, but there isn't any way to punish a large number of deviants. There isn't any way to do that. It's too expensive to even try to do it unless you can colonize the minds of children growing up so they become their own police. And they will report other children who are deviating. It's so efficient, it's so cost effective, and Europe worked this out very, very early. Let me give you one example, since most of you are Lutheran. And that's fine, that's fine. The Lutheran religion is one of the Episcopal religions, like the British state religion of Anglicanism. Lutheranism is another way to make the head of the political state God's agent on earth. Now notice what the significance of that is. If the head of the political state is God's representative on earth, then all the priests or ministers or bishops are duty-bound to report deviation from the state policy right through the ranks of the church to the highest ranks, and those high ranks report to the head of the political state. In Luther's Germany, there were well over 100 separate principalities. It was a madhouse. Probably was one of the finest times in human history, because you could walk across the street or the river and they were doing it a different way. Now, I know I'm simplifying this, but when I get to what Luther did to revolutionize and set the stage for the unification of all these 100 or 150 Germanies, I think you'll see where I'm going. Luther approached key princes, and he said, since he was a rebel against the Catholic Church and had been a Catholic priest, he said the key to the Catholic Church's penetration of the minds and lives of families all over Europe and the Russias is this, that the parish priest has the ability to use some of the church funds for charity, so that if these families aren't going to have a Christmas dinner, it's supplied by the church. And if this bright little kid should get training in watchmaking and he can't afford an apprenticeship, then the parish priest living close to his congregation can do this. He said, what you need to do is appropriate all the social services that the Catholic Church is now delivering through local priests, and to vest these in the political state, so that welfare still exists and schooling still exists, etc., etc. But you now supplicate the political state rather than, he said, that will destroy the powerful hold of the church. And that was, in fact, done in Prussia, in Hanover, in Saxony. It spread through the German states, and the idea spread through Scandinavia. Not that the Scandinavians didn't have their own spins on this, but the idea that the state was the proper father. Even the term fatherland, I don't know if it exists in Swedish, but it's motherland over here, but it's fatherland there. Yeah. So the state is the father. And if parents deviate from the state's wisdom, they should be disciplined. And if they deviate too far, then the family should be permanently split up and the children given to someone who will be trustworthy. That's the beginning of, I think, the empire of Europe, where bit by bit the national sovereignties of the key countries, the most powerful countries, have been eaten away by supranational agencies. And schooling is the principal vehicle. A project was launched in the last quarter of the 19th century in England with powerful help from a few American families who believed that the separation of the two countries had been the worst event in human history, and they wanted to work toward a long-term reintegration of Britain, the whole English-speaking world, as one country. That was their goal of the agenda, and they knew this would take quite a long time. And I'm going to give your listeners a reference that will be from an impeccable source that traces the growth of this thing. So the idea was to bring about a globe under the direction of people who had been reared as the British upper classes had been reared, to be the fathers and protectors of lesser mortals. The idea came about partially from Charles Darwin's first cousin, a famous intellectual named Galton, Francis Galton. And the idea would be that the attitudes, the values that had been forged by the British upper classes, and the kind of society that they had tempered and designed, could become the clothing for the entire globe. And it would take time. I mean, one of the big things would be a common currency and a common language, but they knew that would be a long way off. So they began by setting up 23 bases all over the planet. Now, all those bases are still in business. The one in the United States is right up on 66th Street. It's called the Council on Foreign Relations. And they have different names in different places. But the idea was to draw into that club the best, the brightest, and the most influential people from the entire country, from all races and all walks of life, and to use those people as the resonator of the idea of globalization. And at some generation, not impossibly far in the future, everyone would live pretty much the same, think pretty much the same, eat pretty much the same. There would be colorful differences between Swedes and Americans, and you'd save those for folk festivals once a year or from international food festivals. But essentially, you could predict people, whether they were Swedes, Italians, Americans, Nigerians. You could predict them because they all would have been processed the same way. The vehicle, not the sole vehicle, because all vehicles, including mass media, were to be brought into this effort, but the principal vehicle was forced schooling. Forced because you didn't want to leave an option open for most kids. The entire account of this is set down in a wonderfully scholarly book that has 12 or 13 or even 1,400 pages, written by the personal tutor of President